Well, kia ora everybody. You've just heard my speech, so I'm happy to go straight into questions.
Labor criticised the government for creating the economic growth portfolio back in January. Why have you now created several new roles in the economic space?
Well, what we've said is that economic growth alone is not a viable economic strategy. We actually have to focus on what that growth looks like. Is it positive growth? Who's benefiting from that growth? Growth just isn't an economic strategy, it's a slogan. So what I've set out today are the areas where we think we need to do a lot more work if we're going to create sustainable economic growth for New Zealand that leads to prosperity and benefits everybody.
The message that you sent, quite a direct one, I thought, actually, to people in there who, a lot of them will be people who own other homes to rent. And the pretty direct message was you shouldn't be putting money into that, you should be investing it in something else to the economic growth and jobs. How do you think that message will have been received?
I think we do need to create a culture change in New Zealand away from thinking that the best way to make money is to buy rental properties, because the consequence of that is that New Zealand's housing market is being controlled by fewer and fewer people. And actually I want Kiwis to be able to own their own homes. But I understand why New Zealanders have done that, because actually we've incentivised that as a country. We've given the best tax incentives to people buying, speculating in the property market, and less to those who are actually trying really hard to build businesses. So I think we need to change that. We need to be incentivising those who are building businesses, creating jobs, rather than incentivising ongoing speculation in the housing market.
Will the Labor government look to make KiwiSaver compulsory?
KiwiSaver is certainly one of the areas that you've heard me foreshadow that we're doing quite a bit of work around at the moment. We need to increase our rate of savings as a country if we want to be wealthier as a country. So when you look across in Australia, for example, their savings rate is double what it is here in New Zealand. And it's not just about creating more security in retirement, although that is certainly how people benefit individually from their KiwiSaver. But when you're saving that money in the meantime, while it's generating returns, is actually helping to grow the economy. And so the Australians have a much bigger pool of domestic capital being invested because of their higher rate of savings, and we need to achieve that in New Zealand. So KiwiSaver will be part of that answer, but we're not announcing any specifics on that today.
But you've clearly made a big argument as to why more investment is needed for individuals and for us as a nation. So why not just say today that we'll be...
Because I'm not announcing our retirement savings policy today, but I'm very proud of our history with KiwiSaver, and I think there's huge opportunity for us to do more in that area.
How much do you think it should step up by?
All right, look, we're going to set that out in the future, but we also got to recognise that what we do has to be stepped through carefully. The Australians didn't get to the high rates of savings that they've got now overnight. They started in the 1980s. They've really worked that up over time. Now, we're a couple of decades behind them, but KiwiSaver has given us a huge start.
Catch up though. So do you think at least there needs to be a decent jump up in the first instance and then slowly?
There does need to be a concerted effort to increase our rate of savings, but we can do that in a way, and we can support New Zealanders to do that in a way that doesn't leave them worse off in the short term. And that's why you can't just consider savings policy aside from everything else, because you actually have to make sure that if you're increasing your rate of savings, that it doesn't lead to people being worse off in the short term.
The renewed focus on jobs and the economy, is there a bit of an acceptance that the party in the past has been distracted or focused on other issues that's hurt its success?
When I became Prime Minister, when I took over from Jacinda, I said that you're going to see me returning, you're going to see me as the Prime Minister and leader of the Labor Party and the party itself, returning to some of those core issues that are very important to the Labor Party and always have been. Jobs and incomes are core to Labor's DNA. It's in the name of the party, and so that's absolutely going to be core to our next government.
So do you think that the party drifted from those calls?
Oh, I think we probably didn't talk about them enough, and and the situation has changed. We kept record numbers of people in jobs despite the economic volatility that we faced through a global pandemic. This government have resulted in a huge job losses. Well, you don't create record low unemployment unless you're creating the economic conditions that create jobs. We did that, and this government have done the opposite. They've actually created economic conditions where, on a daily basis, people are losing their jobs.
You've clearly put a big boost on, putting in these new economic portfolios and boosting, highlighting this new economic team that you have with the MPs there. Is that a way to try and prove to the country that you guys have the economic literacy to actually run the country?
I think if you look at our track record in government, and not just the last government, but across the last 3 or 4 decades, actually Labor does have a strong record in managing the economy. It's Labor governments that create low unemployment, get people into good, well-paying jobs, and it is Labor governments that grow the economy. National talks a big game on economic growth. Their track record suggests otherwise.
There are enough people that you talk to in the electorate who will reference the previous Labor governments and say they tank the economy. So is this about trying to push back against that?
That is National Party spin. You know, the reality is we went through a global pandemic. The entire world faced a spike in inflation. That wasn't the fault of the Labor government. That we certainly needed to deal with that. But the economy was set up for recovery at the last election. Yes, it was tough going. This government have actually delayed New Zealand's economic recovery in the steps that they have taken since the election.
I think the electorate questions Labor's ability to manage the economy based on previous...
As I said, National Party spin does not reflect reality.
Your other big thing in there was around bipartisanship. It seems to only really exist, for the most part at least, in foreign policy these days. Do you think that that is realistic or a little bit politically naive, given successive governments often talk about it in housing, for example, and other infrastructure spaces, and it never ever seems to come to fruition?
I think one of the ways that you get bipartisanship is by building a sense of partnership at a more grassroots level, because then things do tend to be less political if there's grassroots support for the approach that the government of the day is taking. Because if it's unpopular to change direction, new governments won't change direction. I think in areas around infrastructure, we've never seen a government that's hauled on the handbrake as fast as this government did after the last election, and New Zealanders can see the consequences of that. So one of my messages today really clearly is we're not going to repeat that same mistake. If projects are underway when we come into government, we will keep them going, because I'm not going to throw those people and their jobs on the scrap heap.
So that's kind of looking at it from a high level, but from a lower level, it's about relationships with the other side of the house. So what are you proactively already doing in terms of your spokespeople and the relationships they have with ministers to actually get this going?
Well, we can't force the government to the table. Peter Gluckman said that on areas around science investment, they should be reaching out and trying to form bipartisan consensus. We have said that we're open to that discussion. On areas like infrastructure, we're going to be going to their investment summit. We're going to have our spokespeople there. We are open to having conversations about how we can get more stability in the pipeline around infrastructure. But of course, the onus sits on the current government to actually reach across the aisle to do that. What I'm indicating is when we form the government, we won't stop everything just because the other side started it, and we will be reaching across the aisle to try and make sure that the new commitments that we make are enduring.
And what about on Auckland? I mean, I know you've already been talking about putting a lot of work in, and Barbara, I think you've been spending quite a bit of time in Auckland as well. How has that been going? Because by taking stuff off Carmel and making it such a big focus and issue, it probably suggests a little bit to the public that a lot more needs to be done. So what have you been doing?
Well, we've been doing a lot of grassroots rebuilding here in Auckland, and I actually want to acknowledge Shannon Halbert, who's been doing that work, coordinating those efforts for us. I think he's done an exceptional job, and it's actually been the success of the work that he's done that's meant that I now feel confident to really lift that up a level and take that up a notch. And I think Carmel's the right person to lead that. I think by saying that our deputy leader, one of the highest ranking people in our team, is going to be leading our efforts in Auckland, it does send a powerful message to Auckland. We've spent the last year listening. We've heard the concerns that Aucklanders have raised, and now we're ready to actually start taking action on those issues.
Carmel, can you talk a little bit to what those concerns are and what sort of give us 3 examples of where you would like to go first?
Yeah. Well, overwhelmingly for Auckland, the main issue is still the cost of living. It's expensive to live here. People are still struggling with putting food on the table. The energy bills are high. And I think a lot of people are feeling disappointed that the government haven't responded to that particular concern. But to start with, it'll just be talking to people about what those issues are.
Coming back to jobs, would Labor look at restoring some of the roles cut under the current government?
I'm not getting into that level of detail today. We had already indicated before the last election that we did need to wind back some of the increase in central government spending that was put in place during COVID to support the country through that. For example, we employed people to run managed isolation and quarantine facilities. We're not operating those anymore, so we needed to wind that back. We employed people at MSD to deliver the wage subsidy, which kept thousands of people in work. We're not delivering that anymore. So there was going to need to be some correction there to make sure that that extra capacity that we built to get us through COVID was wound back again, and we'd already started that work. But this government have gone far too fast, far too deep, and the result is that they've created huge uncertainty, and they've actually created real hardship for a lot of people who we need to be part of rebuilding our economy.
Speaking of scrapping or not scrapping the current government's policies and whatnot, would you get rid of the ban on gang patches?
No, we're not going to change that. I mean, the reality is we opposed it, but we're not going to just be going back and reversing everything that they've done just for the sake of it.
Would you scrap 3 strikes?
We'll set out our justice policy closer to the election.
Would you scrap the fast track legislation?
We've always said that we're open to conversations about fast track, but there have to be better protections for the environment and better protections for communities in there. We had a fast track regime in place before it, so we're not opposed to fast tracking. We do think we need to speed up the consenting process, but there are ways to do that and still protect communities and the environment.
Given that, all of that then, what do you say to people who suggest that your criticism is empty criticism?
We reached across the aisle around fast track. We said to the government we would work with them. We said to them, well, no, on fast track, we said we would work with them to find something that would work and that would be enduring, and they chose not to do that. So it involves the government, whomever the government is, being willing to compromise with their opponents if you want to get more bipartisan agreement. This government have shown a complete lack of willingness to do that.
You know, two big infrastructure
saying that
projects.
you're not going to repeal that. Is that recognition that you think it's actually working all right?
I think, frankly, it's a distraction from the real issues that we need to focus on in law and order, which is breaking the cycle of crime. The gang patch ban hasn't reduced gang offending, it's just pushed it underground. The fact that we've got record levels of methamphetamine use, largely supplied by the gangs, shows that actually, if you want to really target gang-related harm, it's not really making a difference. But I'm not going to wind the clock backwards on everything that they've done.
You know, two big infrastructure projects.
Your priorities, setting out priorities for the next election, probably one of the first speeches in a while that hasn't really delved into Treaty Principles Bill and treaty rights in a heavy way. What message are you sending as far as the priority that Labor will place on treaty issues? Well,
I did reference it actually relatively near the beginning of my speech, where I said, I mentioned the Toitū Te Treaty hikoi and the symbolic, the very powerful symbol that sent. And the message that I take from that is that we're stronger when we come together and we find common ground. The Treaty Principles Bill is the complete opposite of that. And so we're opposed to it. We think it's a divisive debate. And the sooner the country can move on from it, the better.
As far as where treaty rights sit in Labor's priorities going into 26?
It's always been, our position on that has not changed.
Co-governance, would that be back under Labor?
Well, co-governance exists now, and as I said in the answer to the question and answer that you would have heard, actually the co-governance things that we were talking about largely built on the foundations that Chris Finlayson established when he was a minister in John Key's national government. It was hardly radical or new. We were actually continuing work that the National Party had started.
And yet this current government has run a program largely running against that. So, would we see more co-governance, co-partnership appointments under Labor?
Well, what I have said is that we're not going to dial back to everything that we were doing when we were last in government. So take things like water infrastructure. We're not simply going to go back to where we were last time. We will have a new plan that's focused on moving forward, because I think that we've got to break this cycle that this government have really started to entrench, that each government just reverses the things that the previous government have put in place. I'm not committing to what things like water infrastructure reform is going to look like, because we still don't know how the government's water infrastructure reforms are going to pan out in the next 18 months.
What do you say to Māori who aren't satisfied with that answer?
Well, I disagree with that assertion, because how can you be dissatisfied with a position that hasn't been articulated?
Well, they might expect that those roles for them would be there.
But the government, the Crown Māori partnership is very important to Labor. It's always been important to Labor. Will it continue to be important to Labor? Yes.
Can you name two big infrastructure projects, and I'm not talking like a bridge or whatever in rural somewhere, two big projects that you would want to actively work with the national government on?
Well, I'll tell you two that they cancelled that was stupid. One was the work around... One that was around Auckland Light Rail, and the second was around the replacement for the Inter-Islanders. In both of those cases, they're big, complex projects. Both of them are intergenerational projects. They're important to New Zealand's future. And so those are the sorts of areas where we just can't afford to have one government investing a lot of money and then another government coming in and scrapping it all.
Okay, so there's two ideas that you want National to agree with you on. What are two things that National are talking about that you'll happily support them on?
I think you're missing the point. I think in many of the roading projects, for example, they might not have been our first choice for roading projects, but once they're underway, we'll finish them, because it doesn't make sense to simply have a new government come in and stop everything that's already started.
Why don't you get rid of Jan Canetti in the education portfolio?
I disagree with that characterisation. I've asked Jan to focus on workplace relations and safety, which is an area where, it's very important to Labour, and I think Jan's got the right skills and the right connections to bring to that. I have connected, and actually if you look across the board, I've done a lot of refreshing. A lot of people who were ministers previously in those portfolios are no longer doing those portfolios. We're not rerunning the 2023 election campaign. We're going into the next one with a refreshed lineup, and that does mean people doing different roles to the ones they did before.
Is it a demotion for her though? Is
No, it isn't.
no confidence?
No, it isn't.
Has she done a good enough job prosecuting the government on education issues like the free school lunch?
I think Jan's done an outstanding job in the education portfolio. Refreshing doesn't mean it's a reflection on the people who are moving around portfolios. Most people now are doing portfolios that they weren't doing before the last election, because the 2026 election campaign for us is not a rerun of 2023. It is actually, we're going into that with a refreshed lineup.
Okay, so given her experience, is it still on the table that if you were to make it back in government, and she was still to be in Labour's team, she could be education minister?
Well, Jan's still got the early childhood education portfolio. It's a topic that she's passionate about. She's still in our senior lineup. And people who have expertise in areas where they're not the immediate spokesperson are still going to be contributing to our decision-making in those areas, because you'd be mad not to bring that experience to the decision-making table.
Yes, we can grab from Willow Jean just on her education portfolio appointments. What do you hope to bring to that role?
First and foremost, I'm just really humbled to be given the opportunity to take on the education portfolio. It aligns with the children's portfolio, which I am also keeping. I spoke about children in my maiden speech, and that the way that we treat our children, the things they hear, see and feel, are going to be the shape of Aotearoa. And so to be able to contribute through the education portfolio is a very exciting opportunity.
And what's your assessment of the current way the education portfolio is being played out across the country, and the job that the current minister is doing?
Yeah, I think you can't go past what's happening with school lunches, and I think that that is indicative of the way that this government thinks about our tamariki. And it's not just happening in school lunches and in the education system. We're seeing it in the cuts at oranga tamariki and with our children. And so I think that this government is taking us in the wrong direction for those things. We need to be investing in our tamariki. They are our future.
We keep coming back to this idea of holding on to some of the work that the current government is doing. Are the health targets something that you would look at keeping?
If you look at the health targets, were still being measured. Even though we hadn't put them front and centre in the way the previous government did, we were still collecting all that information. All that information was still out there and readily available. I think the difference here is we're not saying you can measure the success of the health system by 6 narrow measures. Actually, preventative health care is very, very important, much harder to measure. But, should we judge our health system based on its success in treating people once they end up in an emergency department with an avoidable illness, or should we say that we should focus on not having them ending up in the emergency department in the first place? And I'm concerned that this government's targets are too easily manipulated if you say that that's the only thing that matters. Actually, what matters is keeping the population healthy and making sure that they're getting the health care they need when they need it, rather than just saying that only these 6 things matter.
How would you go about measuring progress in the health sector?
Well, again, I think I've set out a pretty clear area of focus for us, which is actually preventative health care. It's about having a healthy population who can access the health care that they need when they need it, so that they don't need to end up in an emergency department with an avoidable illness. Making sure that we've got warm, dry homes will mean that fewer kids end up in the health system with respiratory illnesses. But that's not something you can measure in a health target, but it is something that government can do that's going to lead to a healthier country.